Shalom and welcome. You're listening to Temple Talk from the Temple Institute in Jerusalem, Israel. Rabbi Chaim Richman here, together with Yitzchak Ruvain. Today, 15th day of the month of Sivan, 5778. It's the 29th of May, 2018. And this Shabbat, Parshat Beha'alotcha, the third Torah portion of the book of Bamidbar, Numbers. It's good to be back with you, dear listeners. Last week we didn't quite make it to Temple Talk. We were under the weather. And of course, before that, for a number of weeks, Yitzchak Ruvain was flying solo as I was in the United States of America. And here we are, back in the book of Numbers, which is so amazing, the whole experience. And I think that in many ways, this week's Torah portion, which I know is one of Yitzchak Ruvain's favorites, is such a slice of life of the generation of the desert, that enigmatic, mysterious, inscrutable generation that on the one hand was so praiseworthy and so totally righteous and focused on their unique relationship with Hashem. Never been a generation that experienced the closeness of God so much, so clearly, so blatantly like the generation of the desert. On the other hand, unfortunately, as we're going to be learning next week in Parshat Shalach, ultimately, they didn't make it into the land. And I always kind of look at the generation of the desert as a parallel to our time. And this whole experience of the book of Numbers, having received the Torah, which of course we just received the Torah at Mount Sinai on the festival of Shavuot, which we just celebrated 2 weeks ago. And now we are marching towards our destiny, although we, thank God, are in the promised land. But the point is, in terms of the timeline, in terms of the rectification of past faults, and in terms of the whole fixing of the dynamic of all the generations, this is like where we are right now. We want to make a lasting, permanent acquisition of the land of Israel. We don't want to speak against it, and we want to be found deserving of going into the land and inheriting it forever for all of our children. That's exactly where we're at, really, in time and space. And speaking of time, as we speak, at this very moment, there are mortars being fired at what's called the Gaza periphery, the Gaza envelope, the Israeli communities around the Gaza Strip. And by the way, last night and this morning saw the worst barrage of mortar shells, 28 mortar shells altogether. Largest barrage fired on Israel since 2014. One shell exploding right outside a kindergarten, right before it opened. And again, as we speak right now, as we're here in the microphone on Tuesday afternoon in Israel and Jerusalem, there are sirens being sounded in the Gaza periphery communities. Is this normal? Is this the way to live? I mean, who would tolerate this? It's just so incredible how, the world media chooses to portray Israel. How the world media chooses to portray the continuation of the tens of thousands of Gazans that are rushing the fence, rushing the border with Israel in an attempt to infiltrate into Israel, and how the world media wants to portray this. I know, Yitzchak, you've spoken about this over the past couple of weeks, but let me weigh in on it. I'm so upset about it. How the world media wants to portray it as peaceful protests. How we in the Palestinian leadership themselves laugh at that and say, of course it's not peaceful protests. How the Palestinians are armed with incendiary devices and meat cleavers, and how they're talking about invading Israel and ripping the hearts out of the Jews. What about the agricultural terror? What about the hundreds of acres of Israeli agricultural farmland, as well as nature reserves that have been destroyed by fires that have been set by flaming kites, of Gazans that have released flaming kites into the air?
Fires, the amount of acreage that was destroyed, I read this morning, is 5 times the size of the city of Tel Aviv. Just to put it into perspective.
I mean, did people even hear what you just said? 5 times the size of the city of Tel Aviv is the amount of acreage that has been destroyed by flaming kites. Like these kites from hell. Well, first of all, Gaza is certainly hell. Kites from hell. And, of course, apparently one renegade bad boy settler did the same thing. copycat kind of thing. And that made headlines all over the world, like that a settler was a terrorist. Listen, 2 days ago, in the community that we spend some of our time in the Benjamin region, where our daughters live, right? It has a name. Yes, it has a name. Your furrowed eyebrows. It's called Eish Kodesh. My wife and I live there. And once again, hundreds of grapevines were destroyed, were uprooted overnight by Palestinian terrorists. And agricultural terror is a very, very serious form of terror. This cost the growers there in our community hundreds of thousands of shekels once again. And it goes on and on. And again, the question is, here I'm just trying to view all of the news that's going on right now in the context of this month of this month of Sivan, and receiving the Torah, and armed with it, marching towards the Promised Land, and that means marching towards it permanently as a real soul level acquisition and a legacy for our children. And we had enemies in the desert, that armies that came against us, nations that came against us, and we have enemies now that seek to thwart. The Book of Numbers is full of enemies, right? The Book of Numbers is full of confrontations with those foreign kings that stood at the border and tried to prevent the children of Israel from entering in. We have the same thing now, on whether it's on a diplomatic level or on a physical level. We've got all sorts of things going on at the borders. And one of the interesting things that we learn about when we study about the generation of the desert, one of the most compelling and fascinating ideas is the idea of the cloud of glory that surrounded the children of Israel in their encampment. And it's the same cloud of glory that separated between the children of Israel and the advancing Egyptian army as they were leaving Egypt. And sages described that the cloud of glory would basically absorb, and this is actually the language of the rabbis in the Midrash, the cloud of glory would absorb the missiles and projectiles that were thrown at the people of Israel as they were advancing in the desert. There was a cloud of glory that basically acted like the Iron Dome. Now, speaking of the Iron Dome, it's been doing a very good job. They've been really tweaking it. Although I think that some of the missiles, some of the mortars that were fired now in the past 24 hours at Israel from Gaza did hit in Israeli territory. I think that one person was hurt. I think damage has been caused. But the missiles that are being fired by the Iranians in Syria, many of them were deflected by the Iron Dome. So, it's all a metaphor, because God protects the Jewish people. Whether you call it the cloud of glory, which is like a manifestation of the Shekhinah itself, like a mother eagle, like a mother lion that would spring from the boulders to protect its young. That was a function of the cloud of glory in the desert. And now, everything is only Hashem. Whether you call it, whether it's the Iron Dome, whether it's the Iron Dome or not, everything is only Hashem's providence.
Another aspect of the cloud of glory was that at certain times it's rested on the tabernacle, and Israel would be stationary, and then when it was time to move forward, it would rise up. And I also feel, when I was reading the Parsha, it just also struck me as such a familiar feeling that here in Israel today, there are times when it seems like we're sitting still, maybe even treading water, and then times when it seems like a message goes out to all of us at the same time that we have to move forward and we have to achieve the next thing that we need to get hold of in terms of moving.
I love what you're saying. You mean on a collective, intuitive level
yes.
of the whole nation.
Yeah.
I think it works for the individual as well as the nation. I'm saying, I think that this whole concept of the cloud of glory absorbing the missiles and projectiles of our enemies is still working for us today. And you have to say that. You know why? Because the amount of tension, the amount of confrontation, and the attempts that are made against Israel on a daily basis, on an hourly basis, are so overwhelming. If you would just study it and dwell on it and become obsessed with it, you wouldn't be able to live with it. It's so totally overwhelming. Just as the statistics you read occasionally about the amount of missiles that are pointed at Israel at this very moment, from so many different quarters. It's not normal what's going on here. What we face here, the opposition and the constant, exhausting necessity for us to justify our very existence to the world, and it's all so tiresome. But you know what? It doesn't even matter. It just doesn't really exist when you think about the fact that everything here is so totally divinely orchestrated. And you look at this Torah portion, how it begins. It begins with the whole concept of bringing Hashem's light into the world. The very first thing that we're told in this Torah portion is Hashem's command to Aaron to make the light rise up straight. Why isn't this in the book of Vayikra, where all the service of the Holy Temple is mentioned? And in this week's Torah portion, in our video lesson on YouTube, we speak about many details of Parshat Beha'alotcha. It begins with our whole job in this world of bringing Hashem's light into the world. God doesn't need the light of the menorah. The world needs that light. And all of these themes, the consecration of the Levites and their attending to the tabernacle and their duties, everything that's mentioned in that parsha, I feel that it has such a contemporary ring in our everyday life. And when and by the way, another thing I want to mention, in addition to the largest barrage since 2014 taking place this morning, and as we're recording right now, there are still mortars that are being fired right now at Israeli communities. There was also an attempted terrorist infiltration into the Jewish town of Har Bracha in the Shomron. Early this morning, two terrorists from the Palestinian Authority, not from Gaza, but our good friends from the PA, they attempted to infiltrate the town. I'm sure they weren't coming for a surprise a sweepstakes or a cup of tea. And it just goes on and on. Infiltrations, the digging of tunnels, the kite terror, the hundreds of acres being destroyed, the mad rush of the tens of thousands towards the border in their so-called peaceful confrontation. It's all just so staggering. But on the other hand, it's just so unscheduled, and so really it's so understood to me in the context of the fact that we are trying to make this total rectification and clarification of who we are, of what we're doing here, and of what our job is. And the forces that are aligned against us, they really wither and crumble before the powerful presence of Hashem that we feel so strongly. Like you say, the whole idea of the cloud that was the divine sign of the Israelites' travels, right? We read in Parshat Beha'alotcha in chapter 9 from verse 15 about the divine signs of the travels of the Israelites. So during the day there was a cloud covering the tabernacle, and that cloud would be there all day, and in the evening there was like a fiery appearance until the morning. It was always a cloud and fire at night. And the children of Israel knew that it was time for them to move, to take the next step in their spiritual journey, which was manifest with the physical journey. They knew it was time to take the next step whenever the cloud began to move, according to the word of Hashem, literally according to the mouth of Hashem. Sometimes they would be in one place for a day, or for many days, for a month, and sometimes for even longer, and sometimes for only a day or for a night, and then it would lift and they would continue to move, just as it speaks about in that section in our parsha. What a tremendous, lifeline that must be, to see so clearly it's time to move. We read about this now and we think, well, we don't have anything like that now, right? We don't have the horoscope column. We don't believe in that. We don't have a direct hotline to know exactly how we have to proceed. But actually, I think that we certainly do. I think that every one of us, like you said, Yitzchak, both on a national level and on a personal level, I think we certainly indeed do receive divine aid and divine signs. And this is just a metaphor for us. Our lives parallel every single thing that we are reading about in the Torah, that we are studying about in Parshat Beha'alotcha, and everywhere. It's all about us. And we've been emphasizing that for so long, that when we study Torah, we're studying our own life story. We are completing the story of our lives. And so the concept of Hashem signaling to us when to move forward is so true and does occur for each and every one of us every day. Sometimes we are in total denial. It takes a lot of guts to see it and to admit it, because with it comes the responsibility of acting upon it. But yeah, thank God, we certainly do receive these same intuitive signals on the national level and on a personal level. And one thing that really, to me, in this parsha, I call it a slice of life in the desert. It's so much going on. We barely scratched the surface yet as we're talking. There's so much going on in this parsha that's demonstrative of that generation and what it was like as they were preparing themselves to come into the land of Israel forever, which is what we're doing right now. But to me, it's all can be distilled into one idea, and that is, there's nothing in this world but Hashem. You know that? You know that? What is the Hebrew expression? Ein od milvado, right? Ein od milvado means there's nothing else but Hashem. And that is so true, because everything withers. Everything is impermanent. Everything just has a function in this world, but Hashem is the only true reality. That's the way, that's really the honest truth. And the more that we realize that, the more that we understand, then our whole life changes when we realize that, we're not doing him a favor by pretending that we have a relationship with him, by taking him out of a box every time we are in crisis mode and we want to pray to him or we want to feel good about ourselves. So we pretend that we have a relationship and then we put him neatly back so that he doesn't interfere with the other things that we have to do. No, the truth is that every move that we make, every step that we take is guided by that cloud and by that pillar of fire, because there is nothing else but Hashem. And the goal of life, really, which is the goal of Parshat Beha'alotcha, is to make a total bond with Hashem at every moment, and that brings such a total epiphany of joy and understanding when we realize that there's nothing else in the world but Hashem. So here's the story. Open your heart in the deepest way. True story that I heard from a very, very great rabbi. And if I wouldn't have heard the story, I wouldn't have believed it. Right? Older man parks his car in the Bronx and comes back at night, and he's walking towards his car, and there are three men that I'm not going to describe that are coming to him, converging on his car, and they're going to mug him or worse. And they're like coming from different directions, or converging on him, and he's walking towards his car. And he had a great man, a great rabbi, older man, told me the story himself. And he had a moment of weakness for a brief, fleeting second, and then all of a sudden he remembered, wait a minute, Ein od milvado, right? It's on bumper stickers, Yitzchak, here in Israel. It's everybody knows the expression. Ein od milvado means there is none but Hashem. There is nothing, actually. There is nothing in the world at all. There's nothing. The words convey the sense that there's nothing in reality other than Hashem. So he said to himself, wait a minute, Ein od milvado, come on. There's nothing but Hashem, so whatever's supposed to happen is going to happen. I'm with Hashem. If that's his will, that's his will, but there is nothing but Hashem. And as he was saying that to himself, all of a sudden, the three men start separating and going in different directions. But one of them, the biggest one of all, is walking right by him. Mm-hmm. And he says to me, when he was walking by me, I heard him say out loud, if God don't want it, it ain't gonna happen. Just like that. That's the story. He heard him say, If God don't want it, it ain't going to happen.
There you go.
Thanks for listening, Yitzchak.
Yeah,
Good to be back with you.
That says it all. I don't know what to say after that. But the converse of that, or the inverse of that, is, I think, the dynamic of the book of Bamidbar, Numbers, that when Israel, the nation, forgot that en od milavado, or created a separation because of short-sightedness.
Because of fear, because of vulnerability, because of a lack of confidence. That's what Parshat Shalach next week is all about.
Yeah.
And they created like a twinner reality, like a false world in which Hashem is not sovereign. And this is the danger that we all fall into, that we could
crisis of confidence.
Convince ourselves that there's anything else other than Hashem. And that's where we're at now as a nation as well. Because if the more that we realize on a national level that we have a cloud of glory around us right now, and that's the backdrop of the backstory of what's going on at this very moment, with mortars that are being filed. I keep saying filed. I have a problem between my R and my L's, and everything else that's going on that we're facing as a nation. It's all in Hashem's hands, and we have a job here in the world. And when we do our job, we have nothing to worry about. What's our job? It's exactly what's described in the beginning of this week's Torah portion: to light the menorah and to have the flames go up straight. That's exactly what we're doing here. Soon to come, second chances. Major theme of this week's Torah portion. If you don't believe in second chances, get out. Just shut the radio. Don't listen, because this is our whole life. Every day, it's all about the fact that Hashem gives us a second chance. And of course, the total apex crescendo of that concept is the second Passover, which is prominently featured in this week's Torah portion of Beha'aotcha.
And that's another aspect of en od milavado, that if there's only God, if the only reality is God, then second chances seems to be the natural.
I hear the music, Yitzchak, which reminds me not only that we're about to take our break, but that today is the 56th anniversary of the release of the freewheeling Bob Dylan, Bob's second album, 56 years ago today.
Awesome.
What does that have to do with Parshat Beha'alotcha? You might be wondering. Everything. Stay with us. Temple Talk.
Shalom and welcome back to Temple Talk. This is Yitzchak Rubin with Rabbi Chaim Richman. Today is the 15th day of the month of Sivan 5778. It is the 29th of May 2018. We have been talking about this week's Torah reading of Beha'alotcha, raising up the lamps, the lights of the menorah, which is how the parsha opens. And even though it's the third parsha, Rabbi, of the book of Numbers, Bamidbar, it kind of is the first parsha of the book of Numbers, because in the middle of this parsha, which actually has three different sections to it, and in fact the middle section, which is I think 2 verses, is considered as its own book.
There is an opinion.
It's like the continental divide between everything going right, which everything has been going right by and large since leaving Egypt, and all of a sudden everything seeming to fall apart, as if the people just got to a breaking point and they couldn't maintain their composure
Let's
anymore.
explain to everyone that you're talking about chapter 10, and how you're talking about the fact that verses 35 and 36 are written in the Torah scroll with an inverted letter nun, forming sort of like upside down brackets that isolate these 2 verses, 35 and 36, and they become, according to some opinions, somehow considered like their own book of the Torah. So what does that really mean, Yitzchak? How do you explain the significance of these verses? Let's read the verses. You're talking about none other than the verses that read, when the ark would journey, Moshe said, "Arise, Hashem, and let your foes be scattered. Let those who hate you flee from before you." And when it rested, he would say, "Reside tranquilly, O Hashem, among the myriad thousands of Israel." Of course, these are the verses that we read in contemporary days in the synagogue when the Torah scrolls removed from the ark. These are the verses that are recited by the congregation.
Yeah, what does that? Why is that its own book? Except that it seems to express something so elevated, so absolutely beautiful, that concept. And again, we were talking about it earlier in the show. I think it really describes us as a nation being in sync with one another and being in sync with Hashem and moving forward when Hashem says move forward, and resting in place when Hashem says rest in place. And I think that's why it stands on its own. The nation at this point has reached a beautiful equilibrium, it seems, a beautiful synchronization with God's presence and with our destiny, and it reaches that peak, and then that book ends. That's the book of the beautiful synchronization between Israel and God's presence and our purpose on earth as defined by God, as defined by Torah. And then we start a new book, which is, as I started to say before, seems almost like that's the really beginning of the book of Bamidbar, in which we read of the ups and downs and the travails and the troubles of the generation in the desert. And then you ask the question, or one would ask the question, well, if they reach this equilibrium, then what happened? And I think what happened is humanity. What happened is human nature.
That's what it is to be a
But the
human
beautiful
being.
thing of this beautiful gift, it's really a gift that was bequeathed to us by the generation of the desert, because had they just flown into Israel in this perfect equilibrium, this perfect synchronization, what would happen today when we stumble? What would we relate it to? We'd say, we're not worthy, but we are worthy, because even though we stumble, we are stumbling just as they stumbled. So it's as if they're telling us, this generation, this greatest generation, is telling us, you will stumble, we stumbled, you'll stumble, you'll have your shortcomings, you'll fall prey to your own petty desires, but that's part of it. That's part of
Speaking of petty
forward.
desires, though, you're not explaining to me how it works with the complainers. The people took to seeking complaints. In Hebrew, they actually cultivated a craving. They wanted to feel a lust for food, because they were only eating the manna, and they looked at themselves and they said, we want to be more human. We want to feel more of an attraction to food.
Mm-hmm. Perhaps it was the anticipation of entering the land that they decided that it's time for us to become more attached to this physical world, as opposed to being fed by manna from heaven and led by a cloud of glory. Perhaps they were purposely trying to lower themselves down back onto the surface of the earth, so that they could enter into the land and inherit the land, not as this almost privileged generation that was being coddled in a way by God, but they wanted to regain their.
You're looking at it in a very positive way, like you're giving a benefit of the doubt and finding like a spiritual, praiseworthy excuse, as it were, for this kind of behavior. But look at the verses and see that this was not the whole nation. This was a certain group. And I think that that's the key here, is that there is a challenge to see Hashem and to recognize the godliness in what he's giving us and his kindness and what the man represents. And then there's the possibility of falling into this abyss of what you're calling humanity here, but which is actually like a self-propelling kind of dissatisfaction with everything.
Well, it was, as it's referred to in Hebrew, an asafsuf.
Exactly.
Like a
A rabble.
A rabble. Yeah, sort of a mob almost that incited the people, and said, we want food.
It's a mob mentality that breeds hysteria, and it's also a mentality that lacks the conviction of focusing on Hashem's presence, and lacks the conviction of the righteousness of its own path. Also, something that we face today, in terms of all the in terms of all the voices that come against Israel now, from without and from within, all the criticism of how we are dealing with all the crises that we face, it's the same spirit exactly as the asafsuf. It's the same spirit of complaining. Those that are moralizing to Israel, again from within and without, those that are trying to dictate what our path is.
Just as those who try to dictate, those who try to moralize, those who try to deter us, just as in the case, we've been talking about what's been going on in Gaza. It's the from within and without, those politicians and that media, mass media that provides the fuel, provides the oxygen for this violence, because they buy into it, they promote it by buying into this story that the Palestinians are promoting of peaceful demonstration, of people just wanting to regain what's theirs. I mean, the government of
as
South
if it's
Africa,
Israel that's holding them down, when it's Hamas that is manipulating and exploiting its own people, to the extent that last week there was a father of young children that set himself on fire in total despair and protest of the policy of the Gaza government.
I mean, the government of South Africa issued a statement this past week that it's about time that Israel leaves Gaza and stops occupying Gaza. Now, Israel left Gaza in 2005. But
they just perpetuate this impression that all of their problems are Israel's fault.
But again, that's the asafsuf. That's that same mindset.
Israel gave Gaza exactly what they wanted.
Right. And
but their goal hasn't changed. That was just to be the first stage of a staging ground of destroying Israel, and that's what their program is. And the world is fine with that, really.
The world loves it because it sells newspapers, it sells news shows, it sells. It's Hollywood and it sells. So they go along with the script, and the facts and the truth has little to do with it. But of course, back to the book of Numbers, we have that same impulse, it seems, is what you were saying, that those who try to deter Israel from moving forward by inserting these new narratives that, we're hungry, as if the manna didn't satisfy everybody, as if it didn't fill everybody's bellies, as if it wasn't proper sustenance for the people, which it was. All of a sudden, there's this spark of ingratitude and this spark of uncertainty and fear and doubt, which then spreads like wildfire.
Because what do we learn about the manna? As we've mentioned many times, another characteristic of this very unusual, exquisite, and inimitable generation that ate the manna, as our sages taught, the Torah was given to the generation that ate the manna, and eating the manna was like a tremendous litmus test. It was tremendously searing experience, because you had to be very much a person of integrity, and you had to be consistent and wholesome through and through, and not like not a person. These are actually expressions of the sages. Not a person that pays like lip service, but a person that's true to form, like within and without. Because the manna would prove exactly what a person's mettle was, because it was a harsh thing. It was a spiritual discipline, and you really had to be attached to Hashem to be able to eat it. And that was the characteristic of that generation, other than the complainers. But everything that we learn about the manna, how it produced no physical waste product, and how it was also an indication of a person's standing in Hashem's eyes, where it would fall, and what proximity of the person's house. Even in terms of how much was a person inconvenienced in having to go out and gather it every morning. It was a tremendous experience of a revelation of closeness to God for the generation to eat that food, like Hashem was giving them bread from heaven. And so in order to eat it, you had to be totally real. You have to open up your heart in the deepest way. You had to really recognize Hashem in everything and be comfortable with that. And be ready to make that commitment, and be ready to admit, Ein od milvado. There's nothing but Him. And you can't create your own existence like people do today with apps. You can't create your own agenda and try to be your own king and eat the manna at the same time. And that's exactly why the Asafsuf, the rabble that we're reading about here, was complaining about the taste of the manna and how they wanted real food, and how they were resentful of Hashem feeding them, because in order to eat it, it meant that they had to admit that they were completely dependent on Hashem, and that they play a role in His world, and that there's nothing else in their lives but Him. And that's something that not everyone is willing to do. The same thing today, exactly. This is like everything that we're reading about here today, whether or not you see like a perfect physical parallel to the metaphor, this is exactly where we're at in terms of our needing to make the commitment of which way are we going.
What you're saying here, Rabbi, perfectly follows the order of the description. After that beautiful 2-verse book on its own about the ark journeying forward or resting in place, it says the people took to seeking complaints. You said that earlier. And that was evil in the ears of Hashem.
Because not that they were hungry, not that they wanted the food.
Only after they decided to seek complaining, and after they cultivated a craving, only after that did they become it was only after that had they created a disconnect.
You know what cultivated a craving means? They cultivated a craving means...
They cultivated a disconnect.
That it means that they yearned to be dissatisfied. It means that they cultivated, they taught themselves, they conditioned themselves to have a craving. What the craving was natural.
Right.
They made a decision that they are going to crave, so that they can emphasize the singularity of their own flawed humanity, instead of trying to fit into what Hashem has as a plan for His people.
Well, I think that really describes modern society so well. People seek, you just said it now, people seek to be dissatisfied so that they can fulfill a craving. It just seems to beautifully describe,
because to be
consumer society,
a flawed human being is in. And
to have to demand more.
And when you can celebrate being flawed, that means that you have a license also to open the floodgates to all the penchants, and that's not exactly what Hashem says we don't have to do. Hashem teaches us that we can be in control of ourselves. As we taught recently, that's what the counting of the Omer is also all about. The fact that we are not slaves to our own emotions, the fact that we can take control of our emotions and use them to elevate ourselves, to be closer to Hashem. And the rabble that's cultivating the craving and complaining about the manna is exactly the opposite. So there's two forces at work here in the book of Numbers. There's the soul of the people that are preparing themselves to come into the land, and there's this school of thought that is trying to basically even throughout, like in the desert, like go back to Egypt. They're still ready to, and we're going to hear that. We're going to hear that soon. We're going to hear it in Parshat Shalach.
We missed the cucumbers.
They're still ready to go back to Egypt.
Yeah, better to be in Egypt than to and to be moving forward. And at this point, once the seeking of something to crave, seeking something to complain about, infects the people, there's a whole downward spiral. The whole second half of Parshat Beha'alotcha is a downward spiral. There's the meat that God says, you want meat, I'll give you meat for 30 days until it's coming out your nostrils. And then there's this one dissatisfaction after another, and the parsha ends. The parsha, which began with raise up the lights, raise up, bring light into this world and raise it up, ends on such a low note with the complaining of Miriam and Aaron about Moshe, and God's response, which is, how dare you complain, how dare you compare yourselves, because nobody is to me like Moshe is to me. He is my faithful servant. I speak to him like I speak to no other prophet, which is face to face. And Miriam, who was Moshe's champion from the moment he was born, she was the one who saved his. She was the one who inspired his coming into the world. She was the one who saved his life. She was the one who led song after this crossing of the Sea of Reeds, and said, I told you that we were going to make it, even though you doubted. All of a sudden, it seems like she's been pulled into this whirlpool of dissatisfaction, and but at that point, at the very close of the parsha, when she is God has blighted her with leprosy, not the proper word, of course, but leprosy, and she needs to leave the encampment for 7 days until she can return to the people. We learn that the entire encampment waited until she was ready to return before they would move forward. And so it seems like her own fall sort of sobered the people momentarily, because next week's parsha is already Parshat Shalach, and that leads us to the ultimate bottom of the
ultimate failure.
Ultimate failure, a failure of will and failure of being one with God and in step with God. And when things start to unravel, they sure happen fast. For 2.5 books now of Exodus and Leviticus, and now the first few Parshot and Numbers, things are moving forward, very steady and a good pace. And then all of a sudden, it doesn't take a lot. It doesn't take a lot of doubters and a lot of people seeking to be dissatisfied to unnerve an entire nation. And it's a very, very important lesson for everybody today. I mean, I think we see it, that nations can be suddenly derailed when they question their own values and their own sense of mission and sense of righteousness. It's a death trap. And for Israel in the desert, it was a 40-year death trap for those people who didn't make it into the land of Israel. But I guess that's what the idea of second chances is all about.
That's exactly what our generation is I'm always looking at the parallel between everything that we're learning about and our time. And Pesach Sheni is the crown of our generation, really, because that's exactly what Hashem is giving us now.
Another chance to go at it, and another chance to be in step with God and to have confidence in God and in that cloud of glory that guides us and absorbs all those missiles that are being aimed at us, and not to develop, not to try to perfect the craving, sort of a nihilistic attitude toward life, that you always have to be dissatisfied and and be in need of more, and be not happy with all that you got. Because if en od milavado, if there's nothing else than God, then certainly what you have at the moment that you are in is exactly what you're supposed to have and exactly what's right for you. And we move forward, and as we move forward, we try to maintain that synchronization with God's will and be God's people in this earth. That's it, Rabbi. I'm hearing the music. Once again,
We're trying to say something about the 56th anniversary.
well, since we're hearing the music, this is the 56th anniversary of the release of Bob Dylan's second album, Free Will and Bob Dylan. Thanks for being with us, Temple Talk.